to welcome Mike Nagle.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the introduction, and even more than that, the invitation. I think that I've been speaking to the Historical Society or at Historical Society events for at least 10 years, and it may even go back to 15 years, something like that. So I just really look forward to the invitation each year. And I just really appreciate it. And it's really nice because I teach these classes at West Shore, and in theory, the students really want to be there, but they're basically required to be there. And so with this group, it's just really nice to see so many people who are interested in historical topics. So thank you so much for the introduction, but the invitations to begin with. So let me go ahead and start by sharing my screen. Go like this. And, okay, so if you could just, Barb, maybe if you could let me know, are we okay? Can you see my presentation now?
It's perfect.
Okay, great. All right. Well, I'm hoping today, in part because of current events, I'd like to talk about the Great Influenza, or often the Spanish flu. But this is an important event in American history and world history that goes beyond, we should be talking about it anyway, but it's really one of those things that are really forgotten throughout American history. And American history textbooks do cover it. I tended to address this each term when we covered this time period, but I didn't spend very much time on it. And so I really kind of welcome the opportunity to spend more time and to look at it at this event. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about the Spanish flu or the Great Influenza, some of the origins, basic facts associated with it, and maybe importantly, the context of events. Because, 100 years ago, these events were taking place. This was, I probably should have put the date, it's going to come up here, but 1918 to 1920 are the general years that are associated with it. But I think the context of events really influenced the course of this pandemic. I also want to look at the reactions of people and government officials as mandates were implemented, as well as restrictions on behavior. But then how did people react to those at that time? But then, and I don't want to spend as much time on this, but a comparison and contrast to current events and the coronavirus or COVID-19. And I did have to change the presentation based upon an announcement from the Supreme Court just this afternoon. We'll get to that kind of toward the end of the presentation. But if I could just kind of start off here, what we're talking about is really the deadliest pandemic in the 20th century. The image here shows just patient after patient in row and row. In one of these wards, 675,000 Americans died, and at least 50 million, probably more than 50 million died worldwide. And according to one of the major historians associated with this, this really it killed more people in 24 weeks than the Black Death, and more in a year, I should say, than the Black Death killed in a century. The Black Death just ravaged Europe in particular in the 1300s and the 1400s, but it came in many waves. And so this was something that was very targeted in about a 2-year window of time. And if you just want to kind of put this in context, if I could take a headline from a Texas newspaper from December of 1918, this Spanish influenza was more deadly than the First World War, which had just ended in November of 1918. You can see some statistics here with the estimated military deaths associated with World War I. And if the number of deaths from the pandemic was 675,000 in the United States, well, the military deaths from World War I were 117,000. And so this just devastated many communities, and it had a major impact on American history. So what about its origins? What can we understand about this? And historians are not 100% sure where and when this great influenza began, but there is a lot of evidence that it may have started in the United States. I'll talk about the name of the Spanish flu here in just a little bit. But a local doctor in January of 1918 began to notice some things, a unique influenza outbreak. His name was Loring Minor, and he noticed that there was a severe outbreak in his community, and he went to the trouble of alerting the U.S. Public Health Service. And so this is one of the early reports of the Great Influenza. By March, this is during World War I, and I'll talk more about the context here in a minute, but we have the first recorded incident at a military base. This was a private named Albert Gitchell, and I believe he was a cook. He complained of a sore throat one day in March, and by noon that day, there were over 100 soldiers at the infirmary, and the flu just spread like wildfire. Now, this first wave of the flu that came about in the spring of 1918 was less deadly than future waves. It still was deadly, but some people referred to it as the 3-day fever, and they dismissed it. However, it still was much deadlier than previous outbreaks of the flu. The context of these events, well, we've got World War I. World War I began in 1914. The United States entered the war in the spring of 1917. Today, we jet set across the different continents. We fly from the United States to Europe, to Asia, wherever. And that's where and how diseases can spread today. Well, back then, people didn't travel as much. However, because of the war, there were lots of transports of young soldiers that would travel to Europe from the United States, also, from Australia to Europe. And so there was a lot more mobility that came about as a result of the war. And it was probably a factor that led to the high spread of influenza as well as the high death rates. The president of the United States at the time was Woodrow Wilson. He never publicly spoke about the Spanish flu. However, because of the wartime issues, the government did pass limitations on speech with the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act. And so while a lot of the press was curtailed during the war, and so that's why a lot of people didn't hear about this Spanish flu until a little bit later, like not in the spring, but by the fall, it did become more popular. Why was it called the Spanish flu then, if it might have started in the United States? Well, there were these limitations on the press in the United States during the First World War, and not just in the US, but also for the European combatants as well. Spain was a neutral country during the First World War. Therefore, it did not have the same restrictions on the media that other countries had. Well, the newspapers in Madrid actually reported that the king became very ill as a result of the flu. Therefore, that's why it's called the Spanish flu, because it was Spain where it was first widely reported by the media. And it was because of these wartime measures put in place in the United States as well as by other European countries. So it's actually a misnomer to call it the Spanish flu. The first wave led to a lot of sickness, but a lot of people were able to recover after a few days. There still were deaths, but the second wave was incredibly deadly. This is where the most deaths in the United States took place. And the deadliest death, or the deadliest month, I should say, was in October of 1918, when nearly 200,000 Americans died. By the way, I'm talking about world events here, but I'm focusing on the United States for the most part. Oh, and I should have said this earlier, but I'd like to have a presentation of about maybe 45 minutes. But if I can then try to have a Q&A, something like that afterwards, I think we can have some discussion. So it was the second wave was the deadliest wave of the pandemic. Here's one soldier's observation of events. And, you know, the fact that all these young men were getting trained at military bases and they were living in barracks under close conditions, you know, with maybe 3 bunks in a barrack and just these bunks right next to one another, the flu spread like wildfire. Well, this is what one soldier had to say. People were dying something wicked. Something wicked. Truck after truck came by our barracks, all draped in red, white, and blue, carrying the bodies. He counted 65 trucks in 1 hour that went by his barracks. And it was just, if you can imagine, the death rate was really high, but then this also had a huge impact on people's morale. I wanted to show this, the National Archives has a lot of great stuff on their website. And so I wanted to show some things from, this is a record book of patients at a hospital in Washington. So I want to get this a little bit closer. And what we see here is in December of 1918, there were some soldiers that were brought in, and hopefully you can see my cursor, that were brought in and they were observing them for flu, you know, and that came in on one day. But then by 4:30, 3 soldiers are brought in and they've got influenza. And then the very next day, you've got someone who's observed, but at 5:30, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Just at 5:30, they're recording the number of soldiers that are coming in. And as you can see here, this soldier was brought in on, I think it was the 26th of December, and he died 5 days later. Here we see some others. It's just one page of entries. And you see that Ernest Freewell was brought in the 27th, and then he died the 19th of January. And so the death rate here and just the number of cases were just amazing and far more than it had ever previously been reported. These days, I think we've heard a lot about nurses and what they've had to go through and medical professionals. And the National Archives has a great letter from a nurse to one of her friends and her observations from October of 1918. And here she says, quote, "As many as 90 people die every day here with the flu." This is in a very large facility. Soldiers too are dying by the dozens. A little bit later, she says, "I like to work nursing just fine, but it was just too hard not being used to it. When I was in the officers' barracks, 4 of the officers of whom I had charge died. 2 of them were married and called for their wife nearly all the time. It was sure pitiful to see them die. The first one that died sure unnerved me. I had to go to the nurses' quarters and cry it out." So I think that we've heard similar stories, you know, in the past 2 years of medical professionals who are just overwhelmed by the number of COVID patients. And so the same was true back 100 years ago as they were trying to address and trying to help so many of these young, these people who were suffering from the flu. As I say, this was a very deadly pandemic. And if you look at some of the statistics, I try not to include too many statistics today, but I've got a few. So prior to 1918, you know, people died from the flu. But in the years prior to 1918, the death rate was between 1 and 6 per 10,000 people. Well, in 1918, it was 32 per 10,000. Just an amazing spike. And here's, I think, a visual aid that helps to promote this. Again, influenza killed people prior to the Great Influenza, but we see a huge spike in 1918, and this continues until, and what we'll see is it comes in a few waves. It continues up to 1920. There's no similar spike in the 60-year time period that's shown here. What's interesting about the pandemic in this era is that, a lot of times the flu would impact the very young and the very old. Well, that's not how this pandemic came about. Young people suffered disproportionately, and in fact, about half of the people who died were between the ages of 20 and 40. And so if you think about this, one factor might be the war and the fact that so many soldiers were in these confined barracks, and the virus was able to spread very quickly and just devastating people. But also, medical historians have looked back and they believe that there was an overreaction by the immune system. So if you were young and you had a really good immune system, this was probably a factor that led many people to die. It was just, and maybe this is something that we can discuss a little bit later too, as we get into like a little bit of a Q&A, because some of you may know more about this than I do, because I'm not a medical professional. Here we see spikes, another image that shows some of the spikes in urban areas. The city of Philadelphia was hit particularly hard. I'll talk about that in just a second, but we see Pittsburgh, Lowell, Massachusetts, and some other communities here, and just a horrible effect of things. The context of this great influenza was during World War I. There was tremendous patriotism. And so throughout the course of the war, particularly after the spring of 1917, there would be these Liberty Loan events where they would try to encourage people to contribute to the war effort. And in Philadelphia in the fall, and it was in September of 1918, medical officials, public officials were convinced that that the influenza was rising so much that they should probably call off a Liberty Loan parade. Well, they decided not to. And 200,000 people, it's estimated.
Recording in progress.
About 200,000 people ended up lining the streets in Philadelphia, and they were nose to nose with one another. And about 3 or 4 days later, people started to flood the hospitals. It was just horrible there in Philadelphia. The war ended, or the armistice ending the war went into place in November of 1918, November 11th, the 11th hour, on the 11th month, the 11th day of that month in 1918. We celebrate it today as Veterans Day. Well, many soldiers ended up returning home. They didn't come back right away, but as these soldiers returned home, another wave ends up striking the United States. So this spike in the fall of 1918 started to go down, but then another wave begins starting in January, but then it spreads into the spring of 1919. Here we see kind of an image that demonstrates these waves. So in the beginning of 1918, you see that first wave. In January, that's where, that doctor in Kansas had noticed some things. It was in March where you saw an uptick. Then the most devastating part of the pandemic was in the fall, particularly October of 1918. And then you see another wave beginning in late December, and then in January and into the spring. This image shows a community in Michigan, and I can't remember which one, but some historians have said that there were 3 waves. There were sporadic. There was a fourth wave in sporadic communities in 1920, and so some historians say that there were 3 waves. Some say that there were 4 waves to this pandemic. It just kind of depends upon which communities that you were looking at. Barb, are we okay? I heard a little bit of feedback before, but are we doing okay?
I think we are a couple people joined in, but I muted the microphone, so I think we're all
Okay.
set.
All right.
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure. All right. So here we see these different waves, and it was devastating in many communities in that. So how did government officials respond or react to these events? Well, you can see from the image here, in the fall of 1918, some communities begin to restrict public gatherings. And I love this image here of the theaters that are closed. This was a request in this particular community. In some cases, they were mandated. But you see a reaction, kind of similar, you could say, to March of 2020, when the pandemic first was emerging here in the United States. Several cities, and just to name a few, San Francisco, Seattle, Denver, Phoenix, established mask mandates. And I love this photo here. And so I'm just going to show this one here. Wear a mask or go to jail. So I thought that was pretty amazing, seeing that there. And different communities established different punishments. San Francisco established fines of between $5 and $10 if a person violated the mask mandate. They also could serve up to 10 days in prison. Generally speaking, people would get a warning initially. If they did have to pay a fine, it was usually, you know, this $5 range. And then individuals, generally speaking, might get like 24 hours of an imprisonment or 48 hours. But it just would depend upon the situation. And one of the things that I found interesting too is that during the First World War, up until November, while these restrictions were put into place, generally speaking, they were linked with American patriotism and the war effort. And generally speaking, people were supportive. There were some outliers, but it's after the war that you see some more reactions, which I'll talk about more here in a minute. But this was in San Francisco that you see some of these restrictions and the fines here. But in Michigan, so in the upper left here, we see some newspaper headlines where influenza is claiming that 7,400 men died in military camps in the state of Michigan. Battle Creek had Camp Custer, and that was one of the large training facilities. And so it went through the barracks there. On the bottom left, in October 11th of 1918, the governor of Michigan, Governor Sleeper, requested that private organizations like theaters and others cancel their public gatherings. Well, about a week later, restrictions were put into place after the governor met with health officials. And you can see, here, if I can just to make sure everybody can see this. So Governor Sleeper issues an order Friday night following the session of the State Board of Health. And what did they do? Well, they closed theaters, churches, schools, pool halls. I thought it was interesting, the pool halls. So I guess they didn't call them, they weren't saying saloons, but I think that's what we're talking about here. And other public gatherings were prohibited. This was during the First World War. And so generally speaking, people were supportive and they really curtailed a lot of their activities. There were ordinances against spitting that were passed in different communities. These were local ordinances. And in some communities, if members of a family had influenza, they would place these placards on the front door signifying this so that you knew that they would be in quarantine and that you weren't supposed to go there because they knew that it spread, but they weren't exactly sure, how things were spreading in that, but they knew that it did spread. I love some of these images. So just to make this a little bit bigger, Here we see, watch the spread of diseases. The spread of the Spanish influenza, well, that hurts our war production. And so you see this advertisement, this was in a newspaper as the war was going on. So that's linkage between the war effort and people limiting their behaviors and their actions. This is one that I found rather interesting. Stop spitting, everybody. You should use a handkerchief like he's showing there. And you see the trace of a devil type of figure that's shown here. Again, a picture, is worth 1,000 words. I think this is quite a message that's getting put across. And then here you see another public health warning about influenza, because it can then turn into pneumonia. But I just find some of these public service announcements, they didn't have televisions at the time. And so these were in newspapers for the most part. Here we see some children wearing masks. And by the way, the masks that they were using were most often made of gauze, like medical gauze. Some were just like scarves that people would have. Sometimes they would place, they were made of like cotton, and then they would put the gauze inside of it. So there were lots of different types of masks that people were wearing. Here we see a postal carrier, who's from New York City, and he's wearing a mask as he's going from one house to another. I thought this was rather interesting. So the image on the left shows a streetcar in Seattle, and the streetcar conductor is allowing some people in, but apparently in the Seattle area at the time, you had to wear a mask if you wanted to be allowed on the streetcar. And so you see that there. And then on the right, this is from San Francisco. And so there was a public meeting that needed to be held. They had to hold it. So they decided to hold it outside rather than inside as a result of the epidemic. Over time, communities limited, they lifted those restrictions. In some cases, they were in place for about a month. But in others, they might extend to about 3 months. The most severe restrictions were put into place in late October and in November of 1918. And then they extended in some cases, usually until like the end of the year, we'll see here in a second. But this is one newspaper headline from Michigan. And so the Village Board of Health lifted its influenza ban on January 1st as they entered the new year. I like this one here. So these are from late November of 1918. And so sports were interrupted. And so the influenza ban was put into place. And so the basketball league had to be cut short. And then on the right, in Kentucky, that was the one on the left is from Virginia. The one on the right is from Kentucky. So the public library had been closed beginning in early October of 1918, and that ban was lifted by the end of the year. The same was true, you see with a group, a lodge that was not supposed to meet for a while. So how did people respond? How did people react to these mask mandates and these limitations on their behaviors? Well, as I said, during the war, generally speaking, people were compliant and they went along with them. However, over time, particularly after the end of the war, people started to call those masks muzzles or germ shields or dirt traps. The largest community probably that held protests about mask mandates were in San Francisco. And so there was an anti-mask league that was formed in San Francisco. And they really became active in January of 1919. Initially, mask mandates were put into place, then they were lifted, and then as another wave started, people then began to protest. That's where you see the biggest protests after those restrictions had been lifted. And in about the third week of January, I guess it was on the 25th of January, there was a meeting, and as at least 2,000 people attended this anti-mask meeting. And maybe a week or so afterwards, that mask mandate was lifted again. But that was the biggest protest. The bottom right, I love this image because, different people wore different types of masks. And in some cases, people literally cut holes in the masks to allow for cigarette smoking or pipe smoking. And they tried to encourage people, I guess you could say, to wear a mask at least. And you could have a different style of them. And so that's what that's showing there. People who violated the mask mandates were generally referred to as mask slackers. And so here you see on the left, 100 mask slackers were held for disturbing the peace. And I had talked before about some people, they would get a warning initially, usually, and then they might face a fine and maybe a little bit of time in jail. There was a violent confrontation in San Francisco. There was a blacksmith who refused to wear a mask. And he was approached by a health official and he was asked to wear a mask and he refused. And he started to attack this official. Well, the official had a firearm and it went off and 3 people were shot. No one died, but it's an example of some of this opposition to the mask mandates and to these restrictions that were put into place. Different groups had different remedies for the flu. And the product on the right said that there were lots of things that they would resolve, lots of health remedies, including the influenza. And on the right, we see a headline from a Michigan newspaper, another Michigan newspaper, that was from October of 1918. This is during the First World War, where the Spanish flu may have been spread by Germans. And so just as there are today a range of different remedies that people have talked about, the same was true then. I think that they're more widespread today just because it's easier to communicate, with Facebook or other different, social media platforms. But there was opposition to these restrictions and that back then. I've talked thus far about some events, with the Great Influenza, 1918 to 1920. If we can look to, kind of current events, I suppose for many of us, it really began to hit home in March of 2020 and for me at least, when the NBA decided to suspend its season. And this is from March 12th of 2020. That's really when it hit home. And you started to see different states establish shutdowns after that. And some people were fine and some people, were compliant. But after a few weeks, we see protesters who begin to oppose some of those stay-home orders. And, we live in Michigan, and probably the best example of some of this opposition took place, nationwide, took place in the state of Michigan when protesters went to the state capitol in Lansing in April of 2020. Here's where I changed around the presentation a little bit. In September, the Biden administration announced a policy whereby they wanted to require businesses with over 100 employees to mandate that their employees get vaccinated, or if they weren't vaccinated, that they would have to undergo weekly testing. This may be a little bit too late, but if anyone's interested in just kind of exploring this idea of presidential power, you may want to visit a podcast called Can He Do That? And I think this is a pretty good podcast. It's put out by the Washington Post. And while the Washington Post is a left-leaning newspaper, I would argue that this, I think that this podcast is pretty good. And it started during the Trump administration, and I think that if anyone's interested, you could Google that and you could find that. One of the things that I found most interesting is that when you look at the presidency and presidential power, the president has a lot of authority over the military. The president's commander in chief. President Biden said that if you're in the military, you have to have a vaccine. This is part of a long tradition of vaccine mandates that members of the military have had to have. Our first vaccine mandate for the military, well, that came with George Washington during the Revolutionary War, and it was for smallpox. Political scientists and jurists, would argue that that's, pretty well accepted. Federal employees, the president has a lot of authority there over federal authorities. And if you're doing business with the federal government, that's, considered to be, probably, there's certain restrictions. If you want federal money, you've got to comply with those. But this mandate announced by the Biden administration was a little bit further. Well, a week ago, the US Supreme Court heard oral argument on this. And then maybe, I think it was about 2:00 this afternoon, I got a message. I got a breaking news. I kind of hate this, this breaking news stuff. But anyway, I guess it is breaking news. The Supreme Court blocked the vaccine mandate. Now, because it's so new, I'm not exactly sure of the specifics, but initially this was a mandate. If you had over 100 employees, they would have to be vaccinated or they would have to submit to testing. My understanding is that the Supreme Court struck that down, but the mandates for health workers, I believe, is going to be in place. Maybe that can come. I don't have much longer here, but I just wanted to. I think that's going to be the case, but I still don't know for sure because this is really breaking news. What's interesting is that the Biden administration, this is the president. Well, courts, generally speaking, have allowed state-implemented mandates. So there were a couple of cases. The first one was in Maine, and then the second was in New York, where mandates were put into place by the state, particularly with healthcare workers, and those were allowed to remain in place. The Supreme Court didn't hear, they issued very, very quick rulings in those cases. Also, even a conservative justice like Amy Coney Barrett, one of the appointees to the Supreme Court by President Trump, there was a vaccine mandate that was implemented at the University of Indiana. And this was upheld by her. She didn't explain why, but this vaccine mandate was challenged by people, and she struck it down and said, no, I shouldn't say she struck it down. She upheld the vaccine mandate for students attending classes at University of Indiana. So if the federal government is establishing, particularly just the executive branch, there are limitations, it appears, that the courts are going to say on executive actions. But if state officials are doing so, there's been a longer tradition of state officials in allowing for that. One last thing, I just kind of, before I get into some statistics, I thought this was just kind of fascinating to me. When we get into this idea of vaccine mandates and that, how do you get people to get a vaccination? And one of the things that's been true historically is that celebrity endorsements, people who don't know anything at all about healthcare, have actually been very influential in the past. On the top and bottom there, we see Dolly Parton and Queen Elizabeth, who advocated for people to get vaccines. There was some hesitancy in the 1950s for the polio vaccine. So they scratched their heads and they said, who can we get to endorse the polio vaccine? They got Elvis because he was such a star at the time, particularly for teens. And even going back to the 19th century, Charles Dickens, the author, he was an advocate for vaccinations. And he wrote editorials. And it's my understanding that it influenced many people in the 19th century to get vaccinations as well. So I said before, I didn't want to address too many statistics. But at times, I think statistics can be helpful. So if we look at the Spanish flu, there were about 500 million infections worldwide, at least 50 million deaths. Now that was when there was a worldwide population of just under 2 billion. So maybe 20% to 25% of the people were infected with the flu in that era. In the United States, you see that there were 675,000 deaths out of a population of 106 million. Well, if we get to COVID-19, coronavirus, over 300 infections worldwide, and over 5 million deaths worldwide out of a population of nearly 8 billion. And if we look at the United States, over 63 million infections and just 843,000 deaths. And the US population is at about 330 million. So while there are more people who have died of the coronavirus, the United States has a much larger population today than it did 100 years ago. And just, so that people know, where am I getting this information? The New York Times has some really good stuff, and they get their stuff from Johns Hopkins, as well as the state, several states. And so that's where I'm getting that data. And I just thought that I would show this. This was a screenshot that I took today, earlier. And it shows kind of an increase in reported cases as a result of the Omicron variation. And there's also some statistics here on vaccinations. But I was hoping to go about 45 minutes and then have some Q&A. Looks like we're just about there. So I think what I'd like to do is stop sharing my screen and see if there might be some questions or comments or things that people would like to raise.
I'm trying to make the chat screen bigger because there was a question earlier. Okay. Let me see.
Yeah, I can see that now. So.
Okay, it's right. It was about the book, The Pull of the Stars by Erin Donahue.
Okay.
And she was wondering if anyone else had read the book or if you had.
I am not. Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead. It's okay.
I'm not familiar with that book. But it sounds like we've got more of a perspective outside of the United States, because looks like it addresses a hospital in Ireland. There are two books that I would recommend. One is called The Great Influenza. It's by John Barry. And the other, I didn't give you this one, Barb, but I'll follow up the presentation. It's by Alfred Crosby. And I think it's like America's Forgotten Pandemic or something like that. But I know that's the author, but I'll follow up with that.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, did you want to talk about or mention this book in Ireland and it's the focus of that? Is that Jackie?
Yeah, that was me. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, so it's a work of fiction, but it came out, it was kind of fast-tracked, the publication, because it was one of the first kind of pandemic books that was widely available. And I just wasn't sure if it had been well received from a historical perspective. It's pretty character-driven. So my guess is that it would be tough to criticize a lot of it, but I thought that was, it was just a really good book. So also highly recommend for people who are looking for the a fiction version versus a nonfiction account.
So one thing that I'd say is I absolutely love using historical fiction in class, because my students take my classes because they are required to be there. So if I can get a hook, with them. And so a lot of times that historical fiction is something that's really helpful. So it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of that book was pretty good. but the author probably, you know, took some liberties and maybe adjusted some chronology or things like that. But and you could maybe, you know, address that. But I think that historical fiction can be a really great tool to connect people.
Oh,
looks
yeah,
like
it takes place over a pretty quick amount of time. It's just like a few days, but I will say it's pretty heavy. Don't go into it lightly, because it obviously, people do die and people do live, and it actually follows a maternity ward specifically. So it's women, you know, low-income women who are giving birth or about to give birth, who then also have the influenza. So there's a lot of, especially with our kind of in the recent media, where people are just having to create rooms. This is one of those instances where it was, you know, a closet or a storeroom or something like that. So very relevant.
Yeah, okay. Sounds great.
Thanks, Jackie. Ellen wants to know, how did the Spanish flu finally end in the United States?
Well, there was, after these waves, I think it just it petered out. A lot of the people ended up having some immunities to it if you survived it. And then there weren't enough hosts for people. And so it went through different variants. I mean, do I dare say kind of like things that are happening right now? But that's my understanding of it. So.
Yeah, when the reporter from the Record Eagle called, she asked why, one of the reasons why we selected this topic and went forward with it. And that fits right in with our next question from Matt, because one of the answers I said to the reporter was, the more things change, the more they stay the same quite often, which we're seeing in quite a bit of your lecture today. But it also gives us hope that you'll get through it. There's also lessons to learn along the way. And the question from Matt is, what were the objections to masks in 1918? Were they the same now as they are now, with personal freedom and possible side effects, or were they different concerns at that time?
Yeah. So what I've read is there were some who said that my constitutional rights are being violated. And so we've heard that in recent months, and that also, but I think more so, it was a personal thing. I just don't want to wear that. This is uncomfortable. This doesn't seem to be working. And by the way, the masks were largely ineffective, it appears, particularly in 1918, 1919. And so there were some who talked about constitutional rights, but I think that I hear that more today than I have in the research that I've done in previous, for 100 years ago.
Well, I don't know if other people caught it. In one of the graphics, I thought maybe like the graphics that some people had on their masks today, and some had political statements, was like a new thing. And I would have thought the masks back then would have been very basic, used for material. And there was actually a graphic in one of the cartoons, political cartoons, with somebody that had an anti-Kaiser mask on. So I thought that was interesting. But yeah. Go ahead.
Probably during the war, as that patriotism. But they were also trying to make fashion statements too, like, hey, ladies, it was very gender, oriented. Hey, ladies, you could make them very fashionable, and that was one of the things that I had read about too.
Thank you. And then Beth wants to know, how did the disease manifest itself? Was it mainly in the lungs?
Yes, it was airborne.
Okay, now I'm going to unmute Jan Buck. I'm going to ask her to unmute. She's got her hand up to ask a question. Do you want to go ahead and ask, Jan?
I did. I didn't know I had, sorry.
You didn't have your hand raised?
Hand up. But
you have a question?
I would like to say that another very good book about the pandemic is Pale Rider, and that's a nonfiction book, which I highly recommend. It's available at the Benzie Shores Library. I know that's where I got it. I also would like to tell one little anecdote that I happen to know from my grandparents. My grandparents were Dr. Frank LaRue and Nurse Ellen LaRue, and they started their hospital here in Alberta at just about the time they bought the house in 1918. And I was told that by the following winter, my grandfather, who was still a horse and buggy doctor, was out on the roads for 2 weeks at a time, taking care of patients in Benzie and Leelanau counties. And my grandmother was here at home with her young family. She was a nurse, and she took care of the patients who came to the door. And it was how they avoided getting it themselves, I'll never know, but I know that they didn't have it. And it was a terrible time here in this county.
Gosh, thanks for sharing that, Jan.
You're welcome.
And Stacy Daniels has a question. You can go ahead, Stacy.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
We can't hear you. Can you turn your microphone up a little bit?
I'm talking closer to the screen. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Yes, this is more of an observation. I wanted to note, I put it in the chat, that Walter Case, who was the oldest son of William Case, who authored The Tragedy of Crystal Lake, was inducted into Camp Custer in 1917, discharged in 1919, and eventually went back to society, but ended up in the hospital at Camp Custer, dying of pulmonary tuberculosis in 1922. Yeah, it was about that. At the age of 28, he's the one that wrote the famous epilogue that's in the back of The Tragedy of Crystal Lake, and also in the Comedy of Crystal Lake that I wrote. I added an admiration for his epilogue. I wrote the prologue that is in the front of my book.
Okay, any other questions or comments for Mike? I'm getting lots of compliments on it. I did want to remind you that we will have a recording of this presentation on our YouTube channel and on our link to on our website by the end of the day tomorrow. And I'll also include the reading references on our website page for folks. So go to benziemuseum.org if you'd like to look for more reading materials. This was an excellent lecture. It wasn't just the content of your talk, but the collection of newspaper clippings and artwork was just phenomenal. I found them very informative. So thank you so much, Mike. Really appreciate your lecture.
You bet. It looks like someone has a question. It's
okay.
Roseanne, maybe?
Yes, I don't really have a question, just something that had happened. My brother volunteered in North Dakota, volunteered to be a subject for the Pfizer vaccine. And they apparently did a lot of extensive blood work and so on beforehand. And one thing he found out, our mother was born in 1919, and he has antibodies from the Spanish flu, which must mean that I have them as well. I haven't been tested, but yeah, and we thought that was quite unusual. She died at 102 months. So, but anyway, I just thought that was interesting that they did all that heavy duty research and came up with his having the antibodies for the flu. So yes. Thank you for the lecture. It was wonderful.
Thank you for your question and your comment. And Judy wants to know, I have a couple more questions came in, if you don't mind, Mike. What important lessons can we apply to today from your historian's viewpoint?
Yeah, well, what I think is that the idea, so the opposition to the mandates is nothing new. And I think clear and consistent messaging and from whether it's health officials, whether it's health officials who are then advised by people in the government, it is really crucial because misinformation was around back then, and it is today. And so I think that you know this idea that if our messaging is consistent and accurate, then I think that people welcome it. People want to know how they can help and what they can do. And so I think that's crucial. There was another thing that I was going to say, darn it. And it's just, a human behavior. History doesn't repeat itself, but you see shadows of previous behavior and actions. I saw, I'm trying to remember a quote that I saw recently. It's not necessarily an exact repetition, but you see glimpses of the past in the present with a different twist, maybe. So I think that's something that's really important, particularly right now.
That was just, anybody else have a question before we discontinue? And a reminder that to check our website and our YouTube channel for past lectures and Mike's current lecture. And remember, Mike is an author, and so you might want to look up Justice S. Stearns, Michigan Pine King, and Kentucky Coal Baron. I'll admit I should have probably checked to see the local bookstore in Frankfurt and other local bookstores, whether they carry the book. But if not, you can buy that book at Wayne State University Press. They have a really easy website to order books through. So thanks so much, Mike.
You bet. Thank you. The invitation was wonderful, and I love speaking with this group. And so thanks very much.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for joining us.
All right.